Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Schulp, and I'm the Director of Financial Regulation Studies at Cato's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. We're here on this hot day to talk about a hot topic, capital formation, specifically small business capital formation. Small businesses are central to the U.S. economy. Not only are small businesses the primary generators of new jobs, but they are also the incubators of innovation and the pipeline for future large businesses. Small businesses rely on many different sources of financial support, but the capital markets play an important role in helping small businesses grow. Unfortunately, tapping the equity markets can be difficult, owing in part to the complex web of regulations and exemptions that stand between an entrepreneur and raising capital. It's an exciting time to talk about these issues. There's renewed interest in tackling the challenges that stand in the way of matching investor capital to entrepreneurial efforts. Facilitating capital formation is a part of the SEC's three-part mission. SEC Chair Paul Atkins has described capital formation as at the root of what the agency does and has promised to work to ensure that regulations promote capital formation rather than stifle it. And capital formation is something that has garnered bipartisan support in Congress. In fact, just yesterday, the House passed a number of bills with bipartisan support relating to capital formation issues, including bills expanding the definition of accredited investor, allowing for the filing of confidential registration statements, and extending the applicability of emerging growth company status. A number of other bills have passed out of the Financial Services Committee and may see a floor vote. It's also noteworthy that this isn't the first time that the House has been active on capital formation issues in recent years. We're going to start talking about the smallest businesses first. Tiny startups who may be looking to raise their first round of capital, or maybe a bit further down the line, but lack the sophistication of larger, more experienced players. And I'm excited today to have with us three people who are uniquely positioned to talk about the challenges facing small businesses when they are seeking to raise capital, and to talk about solutions. First, Amy Reischauer. Amy is the Deputy Director of the SEC's Office for the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation. The Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation, which might actually rival the length of the title that I have, was established by Congress to advance the interests of small businesses and their investors in the SEC and in the capital markets. Through outreach and education, including the office's annual Small Business Forum, the office works to identify and address capital-raising issues with a focus on the unique challenges faced by women-owned, minority-owned, rural and natural disaster small businesses and their investors. Karen Kerrigan is the President and CEO of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council, which, through a network of more than 100,000 member supporters, works to advance policies and initiatives that encourage entrepreneurship and small business growth. Karen regularly testifies before Congress on a wide range of issues impacting entrepreneurs, startups, investment, and the economy, and she has received numerous accolades for her advocacy on behalf of small businesses. And Jerry Hayes. Jerry has what we'd call a diversified portfolio. He's a longtime entrepreneur, having founded several companies and invested in others. He's also a finance professor at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business, where he teaches entrepreneurial finance. He runs Dorio University, which is a company that educates venture investors and grants the QAI, or Qualified Accredited Investor Credential, and Dorio, which has introduced a product called venture staking, a venture investing startup. We're going to go ahead and get started and hear a little bit from each of our panelists first before we jump in with questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy to start.
Sure. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for having air conditioning. I am Amy Reischauer with the office with the longest title in the agency, but for short, I'll just call us the Small Business Advocacy Office. As Jennifer said, we've tasked by bipartisan act of Congress with a mission of advocating for small businesses and their investors. And to put that into context a little bit, we see small businesses as everywhere from these very early stage mom and pop startups through later growth stage, maybe VC-backed, all the way to smaller public companies of up to 250 million in market cap. So truthfully, we probably have folks that we consider constituents that may not themselves, consider themselves small businesses. How do we do the mission that Jennifer and I have talked about? In a number of ways. We engage in a lot of outreach and education. Our job is to amplify the voices of the businesses and the investors to identify and kind of mitigate or address those challenges that they face. And so whether it's kind of a larger webcast event like this or a smaller policy roundtable or really even just one-on-one meetings, getting to hear from folks with boots on the grounds in that small business ecosystem, what they're facing and what they're doing. One of the significant issues that we've identified early on is that, again, as Jennifer referenced, the rules of capital raising are very complex. So we do a lot of education. We have a lot of educational materials. So if you're here in the building, we've got some hard copies for you. If you're viewing us online, all of these resources are free and available easily. They cater to anywhere from, again, someone who's very new to the capital raising space to someone who's maybe looking for guidance on more specific issues, maybe looking longer term at what does it mean to be a public company. So it really runs the gamut. I highly recommend them, and I'll try to flag them as we're talking about issues today for folks who may not be following all the details and nuances of what we're talking about. In addition to our educational outreach, we also are very focused on monitoring proposed rules and regulations coming out of the Commission and really even on the Hill to sort of identify where those might have or might be likely to have a significant impact on small businesses and their investors. And that's where we will provide feedback from what we've been hearing on those particular, whether it's accredited investor or crowdfunding or whatever the issue may be. And then we also, because everything we do is informed by what we are hearing and seeing in the marketplace, we are tasked by Congress to deliver an annual report, which provides kind of a snapshot of the year's capital raising and how it's gone for each of those life cycles that I've been talking about. We like to think of it as a kind of a unique report. If you're looking for a traditional, Times New Roman courier font government report, you'll be disappointed. It's very visual. We want it to be very usable. We want it to be meaningful to people. And that culminates in our office's recommendations. So again, very data-driven, feedback-driven recommendations that come out of our office. And then two last things I'll sneak in. We are responsible for organizing the SEC's Small Business Forum, which just recently was held in April, which is a kind of a unique opportunity for public and private sectors to come together and again discuss the same issues that we're hearing from today and in the later panel. And then that forum also produces a series of recommendations and again structured by life cycles. So as we're talking today, I will try and flag when either our office or the forum's recommendations are relevant. And then lastly, we facilitate the agency's Small Business Capital Formation Advisory Committee, which, as it sounds, is an advisory committee made up of, I'm going to guess, maybe 20 current members that, again, focus on particular issues and provide advice and recommendations to the Commission. And once again, I'll try and flag those recommendations as they become relevant. And I realize I've given my intro and forgotten to give my disclaimer. So everything I've said so far and everything I will continue to say throughout the afternoon represents my own views and may or may not reflect the views of the Commission, any particular commissioners, or my colleagues on the staff. So bear with me.
So Karen.
Great, yeah. Well, it's fantastic to be here again. Karen Kerrigan with the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council. Thanks, Jennifer, for pulling us together. And I think I said before we started back in the green room that Congress must have found out, or the House, that you were having this event today. So they had to quickly, push through those 7 bills, to show that there was some activity going on up on Capitol Hill. So And great to be with Amy and Jerry. Amy, over the years, we've worked extensively with your office, and actually we're supportive of the office, in the formation of the office. And Jerry, it's great to see someone who's been there that's actually teaching too, that you can provide that type of wisdom, to your students and the entrepreneurs of tomorrow. So SB Council, we're an advocacy, research, and education organization, and we work to promote entrepreneurship and protect small business. And for 30 years now, we've worked on a range of public policy and private sector initiatives to strengthen the ecosystem for startup activity and small business growth. So certainly access to capital, strengthening capital markets, has been one of our core issues since our founding, because it's been the perennial issue, for business owners and entrepreneurs across time, and for startups. So over the years, we've worked on, numerous reforms in terms of all the ways that startups and small businesses access capital, whether from banks, obviously venture capital, angel investors. Two of our members were actually developed a framework for investment crowdfunding, and that was a fun push during those years to see that very quickly, in my mind, get through the Congress and to the president's desk. M&A, IPOs, et cetera. So obviously one of our big issues, and great to see a lot of the activity happening very quickly up on Capitol Hill in the Financial Services Committee and the Congress, the House, passing those 7+ bills yesterday. And now all we do is get the Senate to act, because we're going through this, this has been multiple times that the House has passed, a package of bipartisan support, bipartisan reforms, widely supported. And now we just got to push them over the finish line to the president's desk. I mean, the other obviously key area that we work in addition to the regulatory reform initiatives and regulatory modernization to update, streamline rules and regulations to improve capital access and capital formation, is the tax issue. And we're, that is a big load right now that we're working on, as well as I'm sure many in this room and, online, today is part of the big, beautiful bill, because obviously there's provisions, in those bills, they're different, the House passed bill and the Senate bill, that if you have more of your resources, obviously through tax relief and some of the incentives, particularly some of the investment incentives, whether it's immediate R&D expensing, bonus depreciation, permanency across the board, the individual rates, I mean, that will just be, really boost, the amount of resources that entrepreneurs and small businesses have. And I think even on the Senate side, the title of the finance a text that came out has some changes to the qualified small business stock, piece as well, Section 1202, which would do a tiered approach for the capital gains exclusion and make some other changes that will be very, very beneficial for startups and small businesses. It's not only important to us and our members and small business, that we focused on this. Sometimes it's a pain point. There's been challenging periods, over the last 30 years, obviously periods of disruption during the financial crisis. We did some surveying last year, and while the interest rates were going up, more and more small businesses were telling us in our surveys, 53% of them said that, access to affordable financing, access to capital was actually hampering their growth and their growth capacity, as well as their operating capacity. And we have a survey in the field right now, and we're sort of getting similar results, from that as well. But, we're excited about the potential changes, what we see happening on the tax side and on the regulatory side, and we think there's a window here. And why it's really important now is a lot of changes and disruptions happening in the economy, right? One positive sign that we've seen over the past 4 years is there's been, this change to digital transformation. COVID accelerated a lot. a lot of things in terms of digitization is the number of people who are interested in starting businesses, right? I mean, business applications are off the charts, 5 million plus, each and every year of the past 4 years. They're staying far above, pre-COVID levels. So you have and also the high propensity business applications, those who are more apt to hire employees. I mean, these are the businesses of tomorrow, right? Now, just because they have business applications, doesn't mean they're going to start and launch a business. But if access to capital, was more abundant, we think we would have, there would be a lot more success in terms of helping these people along that have these dreams, that have these great ideas, taking their ideas to the marketplace. And that's, in terms of competition policy and having a competitive, vibrant economy, that is just critical. These entrepreneurs who have these great ideas do take their ideas to the marketplace, create jobs, as we're going through this disruptive period with AI, right? I mean, the industries of tomorrow are going to be started by, a lot of these people who file that first, business application to get their EIN number, with the IRS. So again, we're pleased with what we see. We have to see a lot go over the finish line in terms of great bipartisan measures that have been advanced at least through the House. But we do have this window of opportunity, and we hope, during this, over the next couple of years, and maybe we'll see a lot of this moving forward, and set us up for long-term growth, competitiveness, and make us, keep us the best place in the world to start and grow a business.
Thanks. Jerry?
Good afternoon, Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jennifer, for the invitation. It's an honor and a privilege to be on this panel with my distinguished co-panelists, and I look forward to learning from each of you today. Thank everyone here for going through the heat to be here personally, and for those that are watching virtually. I have a lot of family and friends and fans that are watching, so thank you for being here. As Jennifer mentioned, I've been teaching venture at Indiana University for 21 years. I'm here as founder and CEO of Dorio, named after the father of venture capital, George Dorio, the French-born American Harvard professor that invented the United States game of venture before Silicon Valley even existed. Dorio represents the millions of young people across the globe that are thirsting for entrepreneurship and capital creation opportunities. And indeed, if our community is to survive, or our culture is to survive, we must teach our young people not just to compete, but to win. And the United States game of venture today is not a winnable game, starting with our investor protection standard. It is based on a single question: who gets the right to lose their money? If you're a millionaire, you can lose everything. If you're not, you're locked out of the system. Now, I don't blame the SEC or the United States to adopt that standard in 1933 in the throes of the Great Depression, coming off the 1929 stock market crash. But to bring that standard forward into the modern era has had detrimental effects on the United States economy, and in particular, the entrepreneurial and innovation economy. Because with that standard, and the modern system is engineered by Silicon Valley insiders, this game is only winnable if you're wealthy and connected. If you're wealthy and you're not on the inside, you are a target, in fact, a potential bag holder. One need not look any further than the red-hot secondaries markets that are happening right now. Silicon Valley insiders are offloading their shares and cashing in big time on the backs of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of accredited investors. Silicon Valley does not share in the upside. They offload the risk, productize it, and call it opportunity. The Reg CF and the Reg A regulatory platforms were designed to be an alternative to the Silicon Valley model of venture. And I, for one, am a huge proponent of both of those regulatory platforms, and I'm a big supporter of many of the players within that sphere. But here is the miscalculation. They've attempted to cram the Silicon Valley model of venture onto the retail investor, and I'm here to tell you it is never going to work. Meanwhile, sports betting, high-risk options trading, meme coins, and prediction markets are going through the roof. The United States is conditioning its young people to be gamblers when we need to be teaching them how to be capital creators and owners. And up to this point, nobody has dared to disturb the sanctity of this broken system. On April 15th, 2025 tax day, we unveiled a patent-pending winnable game of venture. It organically weaves Reg CF, Reg A, and Reg D into the framework. We don't need permission from Congress, nor do we need permission from the SEC. It is designed to unearth tens of thousands of new entrepreneurs each year and to bring along millions of small investors to meet those entrepreneurs at the very beginning of their journey and to stay with them till the very end, regardless of that outcome, under the principles of shared information, shared risk, and shared prosperity. And because our system of venture does not involve the offering of an investment contract as defined by the Howey test, in fact, our system involves the offering of a social contract, where education and reputation are the currencies, we've had to come up with our own system of protection. In foreseeing this today, a while back, I contacted the SEC and found the rule makers inside the SEC, not the Office of Advocacy, but the rule makers who are focused on investor protection. And I've shared with them our entire playbook and all of our products. And I've offered them to the SEC to utilize in protecting investors with their own schematics. They've not responded, which is fine, but no one can argue this, that our protection model that we use through education is far more protective than anything Congress or the SEC requires today or could imagine even tomorrow. I'll pause here, but I'll leave you with this vision. If Silicon Valley venture is tennis, our game of venture, called venture staking, is pickleball. Same court, different rules. Everyone can play, anyone can play, and everyone will want to. Thank you.
Thank you all. I would say we've got a lot to talk about. So small business capital raising is a broad topic. And I want to make sure that we're going to start here by kind of bringing along our audience with us who might not be as familiar with the concepts of kind of capital formation and why a business might want to raise money through a securities offering rather than going to a bank or rather than using their own savings. So I'd like to just set the table and ask, why would an entrepreneur want to raise capital through securities rather than trying to get a bank loan or trying to find some other way of getting money that doesn't involve the complications of dealing with the SEC? I say Amy looks like she wants to answer this one.
Wants to. I do. I do have a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think there's more than two reasons, but I sort of think of them in two ways, and maybe it's like a glass half full, glass half empty kind of way. One is some businesses get to the point where they are ready to take on investors. They're ready to share the risk and the reward of what they project to be the future of that business. Not all companies get there. It's not the right place for all companies to be, but there's that, like when you're ready to share the ownership of the future of your business, then investors become the right place to be. I think that's the sort of optimistic perspective. Maybe a more realistic perspective is there are several funding options for small businesses. I think it's about 60, actually even more than that. A vast majority of businesses in the 60 to 65% range, are self-funded, whether it's revenues or, personal savings or, cash reserves. We're only looking at about 40% of businesses that go to external capital at all. And that external capital, also a big pie. Most of that is loans, lines of credit. I think it's about 69% of that 40%. When you're looking at how many companies actually go to raise capital from investors, it's about 2% of small businesses that do. So this is a tiny slice of a pie, right? Why do they go there? It may be that, and for a number of companies it is because those those non-dilutive sources of funding, the bank loans, aren't available for whatever reason, whether it's, or are not available in a way that that company is ready to take on. There's been a drop-off in community banking. There's, unpredictability, insecurity in the general economy that might, whether it's interest rates or whatever it might be, that's making debt financing or lines of credit less appealing to those companies. So it could be folks that don't, for whom those other alternatives aren't there. So maybe the company is ready for it. Maybe they could get a bank loan and do it all through non-dilutive capital, great, but they want that shared risk, shared reward, or maybe it's because these are the options that are left for some of those small businesses.
And I think you've all started to touch a little bit on this, but I want to dive in deeper and just ask the basic question: what are the biggest challenges that small businesses face in trying to access this type of capital?
So it really depends on the type of business, because if it's for example, if you're going to start a product distribution company where you can buy a product and immediately go try to resell that, the capital costs are going to be a lot different than creating a new product or bringing a new idea to market. And when you do that, you've got this huge gap of time and uncertainty from where you want to where you want to be, or to where you want to be and where you are today. And banks won't fund uncertainty; they want to fund predictability. And even if they are willing to fund the predictability, there's this thing called a personal guarantee that is not the funnest thing to sign, having done that personally myself. So when you have those entrepreneurs that are looking to create and bring something new, a new innovation to the market, they almost have no choice, unless they have a wealthy family that they can self-finance, they have no choice but to access the capital markets or the equity markets to do that.
I would say, Karen, you mentioned some survey data that you had from your memberships about having difficulty in accessing capital. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about what those difficulties are? Are there specific problems, or is it just it's tight out there?
Well, if you look over time, it depends on economic conditions, right? It depends on, a lot of things. It depends on, the risk aversion of, depending on economic conditions, right? A lot may focus on regulatory threats or regulatory conditions. For some businesses, they may think they're ready, and they may not be lendable. It could be education and training and, lack of sophistication. From a securities perspective, the complexity, right, of doing that. So, the cost, the availability of capital, economic conditions, where they may be located, geographically, I think, is another issue. The type of business or type of sector, that they may be in. So there's a lot of variations, in terms of why they may be challenged at different periods of time. And again, some has to do with, regulatory conditions, that is why, obviously, we need reforms and changes and that are going to make capital more abundant and widen the pool, of investors and, obviously, improve conditions, overall for all businesses across time, regardless, of these type of political or economic conditions, geopolitical conditions, whatever the situation may be.
And Amy, you hear from a lot of businesses and a lot of the people who are looking to raise money about, say, both the challenges that they face, but as well as trying to interact with the system. Are there any kind of general themes that come up more often, particularly in terms of kind of the regulatory environment?
I think, depending on the life cycle or the regulatory pathway we're talking about, I think we've touched on it a little bit, the idea of having access to a network of folks who can, like knowing where to even look for investors. If you're in, I don't want to say a coastal hub, but a capital raising hub, that may be easy. If you're sitting in Silicon Valley, it may be easy to find investors. If you're sitting in, the central western Rocky, you may not have the same access to networks. We hear a lot about, how do I, if I'm not born into or did not go to school with the network of investors, how do I find that? So that need for connectivity, that need for mentorship, it's not something the SEC can regulate, but that kind of ecosystem building environment, I think is really a challenge when it's not there. And then I think as you get into kind of the more regulatory things, I think it's, the crux of the SEC is balancing the investor protection with the access to capital. And with that comes the balancing of the costs and benefits of any particular capital raising pathway. So it's, how can we continue to protect investors while maintaining a reasonable cost of capital for the issuers that are trying to rely on that particular capital raising.
I'm going to come back to the network comment that I've heard a couple of times now, and kind of transition to talking about crowdfunding, which was one of the means by which Congress proposed to start to solve that network problem. Crowdfunding was envisioned kind of as a game changer for the smallest companies, a way for them to reach diffuse investors across the country over the internet with very low overhead. And I'm curious if that vision, which has now been operating since about 2016, has been realized. And I'm going to start with you, Amy, and I know it wasn't your office that released the data, but I'm sure you've taken a look at it. The SEC recently put out a report on kind of the state of crowdfunding over the past roughly decade. What does that data tell us about, say, how crowdfunding has been functioning, and has it been doing what you'd hope to see it do?
In the grand scheme of offering exemptions, and for those following along at home, your very quick Securities 101, every time you offer and sell a security, you either have to register it with the SEC and go through sort of an IPO process, or you have to find an exemption. So I keep throwing around regulatory pathways. Most of the ones I'm talking about are exemptions. So crowdfunding is one such exemption. And I think, to your point, it has been sort of this 9 years of an experiment. And, we've gotten feedback in both directions there. But DERA, our Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, did put out what is a periodic report that they put out on crowdfunding to kind of show us how it's going. Generally, it is one of the smaller, in terms of aggregate amount and number of deals, it's one of the lesser used exemptions or pathways. Last year, and I'm drawing from our annual report as well as DERA, but just to give you a sense, last year about 250 million in the aggregate was raised under reg crowdfunding. Since inception, and I'm going to cheat and look at the notes because I want to give you accurate data. Since inception, so since May of 2016, they've raised an aggregate, and this is based on reported proceeds. So reportedly, they've raised an aggregate of 1.3 billion over 9 years. So again, it's stayed relatively small compared to some of the other alternatives that are out there for businesses. And that's been in just shy of 8,500 offerings. Interestingly, at least to me, as a bit of a data nerd, only about So of the 8,500, about 7,100 of those are unique issuers. So there's a fair number, 900 or so issuers that have gone back to crowdfunding and done 2 or more offerings over time. So perhaps it has been useful, and successful for some companies. The other, just to give you a sense, the average raise is about 345,000, and because data skews, the median raise is 800. In either case, it's below the original maximum offering amount of crowdfunding. It started off at $1 million. There were a couple of adjustments, and then eventually it was increased to $5 million. So these are offerings of only up to $5 million, but the average offering amounts aren't hitting that $5 million cap. We can talk about why or how to improve that at another part of the conversation, but that's a bit of a snapshot. Oh, I guess one other thing that was of interest to me, 2 other things. One is the cost kind of commission rate of raising that capital, depending on how they're structuring the offering. So a crowdfunding offering is one, it's conducted online, and it either has to be run through what's called a funding portal or a full-blown broker-dealer. So there's an online intermediary that manages the process of the offering. The commission and cost rate on these offerings is running between 6 and 7.5%, depending on whether you're using a broker-dealer or how you're structuring the offering. So when you're talking about an offering of $1 million and $1.5 million, you're talking about costs that are approaching 6 figures. So that's sort of another interesting data point. And then lastly, I would say, so when DERA came out with the data, they confirmed that most crowdfunding, the states with the most crowdfunding offerings are, not surprisingly, because this is true of probably all offerings, California, New York, and Texas. So you're still getting that concentration in some of the hubs, and now I'll do a shameless pitch to my own office's resources. We have, again, credit to the staff and our economists in DERA, but we have that data available in some interactive maps where you can look visually at the map of the U.S. and see where and how much is being raised in a registered offering or a Reg D offering or a Reg A offering, as well as crowdfunding. And you'll see that same concentration in those kind of capital raising hubs, if you will. When you look at crowdfunding, it's a little smoother. It's still concentrated, but you're seeing more of the crowdfunding offerings in some of those more sort of middle of the country locations. So I don't know that they highlighted that in the most recent report, but they have followed that over the years, and that's been a trend. So,
Yeah. Karen, Jerry?
Yeah, well, I'll just, I'll say this, that, and then I know that they put out their data, and I think it was mentioned that there might be conservative estimates based on some things, but I know there's been some other, data that the private sector has tracked that has found like $2.8 billion has been invested, over 8,000 companies, 2,900 of those have been minority and women-owned businesses, and other successes in terms of large number of investors, over 2.1 million investors involved in investment crowdfunding. So the promise of crowdfunding, it definitely checks off a lot of the marks, right, in terms of democratizing access to capital, women and minority-owned businesses, having access to capital. But for me, this was just part of an experiment, if you will. If I look at, for example, health savings accounts, which are widely used, there was Archer MSAs and HSAs, there was a long adoption period, they had to make some changes. There's certainly, I think, some changes that need to be made to crowdfunding to really reach its true promise and true potential. I think it has extraordinary potential. A one-size-fits-all approach to compliance maybe needs to be changed, right, in terms of having a two-tiered approach or a multi-tiered approach for companies that are just raising 100 or 150 or 200,000. I mean, you may not see a lot of those raises because a lot of that money is actually going to compliance and other fees, and so it really isn't, maybe worth it, for those businesses to use, for those sides of those size raises. So I think we got to look at a little bit more in terms of streamlining the compliance, right? Doing things, essential disclosure, for some of the smaller raises, and then a more robust system for the larger raises, but also to increase the amount that can be raised, from 5 million, much higher. I think if we're going to do this, we should do it right, and you will see, I think, a lot more success. But I think it's what we said it's going to do, but it can do much more. And we can leverage the success and make some refinements that will really, I think, improve it for all different types of startups and small businesses.
I'm going to let Jerry jump in because I know he has something to say, but before he does that, I want to let our audience know that we will be taking questions from the audience, both online and in person. If you are online, feel free to submit a question on the website or on any of our social media accounts. If you're in person, we'll have a mic for you. But Jerry can...
And one of the, I think some of the other broader type of capital formation reforms that we're seeing moving through that will also have a benefit for crowdfunding as well. So anyway, it's not just, it's part of some broader reforms that are happening that, will support this ecosystem. So, sorry, Jerry.
That's fine. So actually, I don't think the regulations are all that bad. We've invested in our experimentation, we invested in 75 different offerings through Reg CF and Reg A. And I frankly would love to see the future trend in this direction. The SEC is correct. More disclosure is important. If you're going to raise money from other people, the future is about transparency to the communities that are entrusting their dollars to you. I'm a huge believer in this radical transparency movement. I'm not a fan of hiding behind, sort of cloaked in secrecy and around these offerings. I don't think it's that bad, and I frankly think it's worth the regulatory, the cost of compliance. But you both touched on an issue that's incredibly important. It's called distribution. Distribution is incredibly difficult because when I started studying these markets back in 2018 and doing a lot of experimentation and have countless conversations with investors and the players within the system, crowdfunding up to this point has been more of a very efficient way of doing a family and friends round, right? So, a founder, you've got friends and family and some customers that come in and they'll invest. But what we have found with all the platforms, they've had a difficult time getting those to cross over into being venture investors. And the way to win the game in venture is two things. You have to take advantage of two things. One is the power law, which means you have to have a little bit of money. No matter what your budget, you have to have a little bit of money in at least 50 deals. We've run Monte Carlo simulations. That's the minimum, is to have a little bit of money into 50 deals. Not very many investors have the patience or the perseverance for that. That's what we teach, right? That's the first one. And the other one, it's called the convexity of returns. It's kind of like poker. You buy an ante and you get cards, but if you got a winning hand, you want to keep betting on that particular company, and you have to be able to take advantage of the convexity of returns. And barring those two being in, it's not a winnable game. And I think that it's not the regulatory issues that we have. It's just, if you think about Silicon Valley has layered a game on top of the regulatory structure that has existed since the SEC or whenever, sort of came into, arose. But we have to think about layering different games on top of these regulatory structures, and I think there's a massive opportunity to layer a game on top of Reg A and Reg CF. So I'm actually quite bullish on the regulatory structure today.
Yeah, I still think there's great potential, and we're still on the early stages of this, and again, it's sort of success breeds success, more successes, and working with more entrepreneurs and more startups and more small businesses about this option, and just the education and training that needs to go into it. So I still think we're in the early stages and we have great success. I would tinker though, and make some of these regulatory changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
A tax credit for your first $1,000 or $2,000 of Reg CF investment. I think the crowdfunding professional associations is working on that. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Let me get in one more tinkering question before we get to audience questions. And that is going to pick up on something that you said, Karen, about kind of the multi-tiered approach to compliance. And you talked about it in the Reg CF context, but we've seen a couple of times now proposals coming out of Congress for a micro offering exemption, which would say they come in a couple of different forms depending on who's doing the proposing. But the idea would be to dramatically decrease compliance obligations for kind of the smallest raises, $250,000 or less, or $500,000 or less. I'm curious, kind of thoughts about, do we need another tier for the smallest offerings? Or is it a question of trying to figure out how to make something like Reg CF work for those kind of baby capital raises?
Well, we support that micro offering legislation. I mean, I think more choices are better for small businesses. I know the argument is, well, gee, it just creates more complexity, but for who? Is it the regulators or for the small businesses that need the capital? So, you know, I just think it's another option and important, well, and one particularly important, again, for those small businesses that want to, those small raises. I think that will really make a big difference, you know, for them, you know, to scale in small ways, and they can move to other rounds and just, you know, build, you know, to build their businesses. But so I think since we have this system, we might as well, where we are right now with it, is make it work for startups and small businesses. And so having this tiered offering to me makes sense, and it would fill a market need.
Okay. Any questions in the room? Say we've got one in the back.
David Burton, the Heritage Foundation. You've talked about the sort of distributional issues and the fact that so much money is raised in concentrated areas. One of the ways that we could address that problem is by addressing what's sometimes called the finders or private placement broker problem, and you haven't talked about that. There's been legislation that at one point passed the House called the Unlocking Small Business Capital Act that would allow people to take a small fee, 2% or whatever, for making an introduction to an accredited investor. So a guy in Peoria who doesn't know very many rich people could hire a finder, and then the finder could introduce them to rich people that might invest in their Peoria company. The SEC has basically been extraordinarily irresponsible in this area by yanking all the guidance saying that was okay, and then saying that that finders should be regulated like Merrill Lynch as a broker-dealer, and basically put all finders and private placement brokers in a mess. The ABA came out with a big report saying that this needs to get solved. So this legislation would address it by basically providing an exemption for intermittent finders and a very light regulatory regime for people who are in the business of being private placement brokers. And I was wondering what the panel thought about that as a problem and a solution.
I can bravely say, anyway, that our office has supported for years now additional clarity in this space, because it's a challenge for the businesses, and it's also a risk for the investors who, or the founders who may be looking for someone to play this role, and one wants to know that the person playing this role is doing it the right way, whatever that ends up meaning. So I know our office agrees with the need for clarity on this. You know, it's not been on the Reg Flex agenda in recent years. We don't have a current Reg Flex agenda, so I can't comment on what might be coming up. But you know, we agree that this is a space that clarity would be helpful.
David, we've been SB Council supportive of the finders legislation, and you know, it sort of again, it goes back to this sort of networking effect and who you know, and sometimes you just don't know, and you know, there's people out there that know other people. I mean, basically we're wasting human capital, you know, in this regard in terms of connecting people, and you know, from our perspective, it will unlock a tremendous amount of capital if this is made available to entrepreneurs, this service, there's clarification, without the broker-dealer, type of requirements that are involved. So, yeah, I mean, from our perspective, common sense makes sense. And yeah, we hope that the House and the Senate address this real soon.
David, the only thing that I'm not familiar with the rule. I would only suggest that may be helpful to try to get into the accredited investor regime or the network, but I think the real opportunity for capital formation for the myriad of entrepreneurs out there who are thirsting for this is to unlock the retail investor. And I don't think that would really be as helpful for the retail investor. I think the pathway to the retail investor is education and certification, that they understand what they're doing, and those who are certified are there ready to invest. And if you can bring them into a large community and they are right there ready to go, I think that has far more impact for capital formation than trying to find a way to get to the accredited investors in a different way.
There's so much that we have not talked about. I feel like we could go all afternoon on this, and we are running out of time for questions. So what I want to do to make sure that we kind of tackled like our final task here, which was making sure that we are proposing solutions, is to do a quick lightning round, if you can do it, asking what one reform would you like to see that you think would make the most difference? And that can be general, or that can be more specific, but something concrete. I'm going to start with Jerry.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we've seen in the state of Indiana, and I think other states around the United States have done this, is they've offered a tax credit on state income taxes if you've invested in a startup, up to 25% recovery. A tax credit up to $2,000 for retail investors to invest in the crowdfunding system, or Reg A, I think would be massively beneficial to capital formation.
It is so hard to pick one thing, because I think it's the cumulative, of many things, like the expanding the accredited investor definition, some of the bills that we've seen pass the House that have support in the Senate, testing the waters. I mean, just some common sense things that allow people to, network and expand their networks, and to identify, people who can invest in their firms, the finders, piece that David brought up. There's not just one single shot solution. I do think it's, and it's just streamlining, what's been going on, streamlining and modernizing a lot at the SEC and the securities law, so that, they do make sense, that they're tailored, for the entrepreneur and the small business owner. So I know I fail in terms of that one thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, ideally, but it's the whole host at our website, sbecouncil.org. We have all of our capital formation, capital access proposals that folks can read. There's a lot there.
Well, and I'll take your
and
one
not
thing as
penalizing investment,
streamlining.
zeroing out the capital gains tax. I mean, come on.
I will shamelessly lob in an even cuter response to that, and that is that, I'm not going to pick one because Amy's opinion is way less interesting than what our office can do. So I will put in a shameless plug that these ideas, your one big change that you want to have made, the laundry list on the white paper that I know everyone has prepared to turn in, or somewhere in between, our office wants to hear those, because those are the voices that we amplify. So we are easily accessed through small business at sec.gov. We want to hear what your big issues are, what your big proposed solutions are, so that we can amplify those in our discussions with the commission, in our discussions with the rulemaking staff, in our discussions with the Hill. So how's that for a non-answer?
A great one. Thank you all. As I said, we barely scratched the surface of the number of different types of issues that are at play when we're talking about small businesses, raising capital and supporting entrepreneurship. In fact, we talked very little about how investors are involved in this space as well. I would love to continue this conversation another time, and I hope everyone listening and in the room with us today also continues that conversation. We will be back after a short break with our next panel that's going to focus on companies that are larger and the pathways to becoming a public company. Thank you very much. Welcome back. I'm Jennifer Schulp, the Director of Financial Regulation Studies at Cato Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Our first panel focused on issues impacting the smallest businesses. But startups raising capital are hardly the only businesses that face pressure points in the U.S. capital markets. As businesses grow, their capital needs change, and so do their sources of capital and the regulations that apply to tapping that capital. Rather than talking about crowdfunding and Regulation D, when we're talking about smaller businesses, we still might talk about Reg D, but we're often talking about IPOs and mini IPOs, also known as Regulation A. What are the benefits to companies and investors of having publicly traded companies? And what challenges do companies face as they look towards the public markets? And how do we resolve them? Let's tackle some of these questions this afternoon with our panel of experts, who I'm happy to have join me here today. Directly to my right is Cromwell Coulson, who's the president and CEO of OTC Markets Group, a publicly traded company that operates 3 public markets for 12,000 securities that trade nearly $445 billion in dollar volume annually. Hopefully those numbers are up to date. Cromwell is a strong advocate for improving capital formation. You may have seen his guest column last week in Capital Account, and he's testified before Congress and spoken at numerous industry conferences on these issues. Alex Platt is an associate professor of law at the University of Kansas School of Law. His scholarship focuses on securities regulation and corporate governance, and his work has been published in leading law journals and featured in the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and other outlets. And finally, Joel Trotter is a partner at Latham & Watkins LLP, where he co-chairs the National Office, a central resource for clients and lawyers facing complex issues arising under the U.S. securities laws. Joel has successfully guided public companies of all sizes through major transactions, bet the company corporate crises, and regulatory matters. And Joel was instrumental in the 2011 IPO Task Force report to the Treasury Department, which laid the groundwork for a number of reforms that were passed in 2012's Jobs Act. Like the last panel, I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to say their piece at the beginning for a few minutes, and then we'll move into questions. And also, like the last panel, we will be taking questions from the audience, both in person and online. So if you're in the room, get your questions ready. And if you're online, feel free to submit a question on the website or on any of Cato's social media accounts. So let's get to it. I'm going to go ahead and start with Cromwell.
Hi, thank you, Jennifer, for having me here. I run OTC Markets Group. We're a public company traded on our own market, and we look at ourselves as there's the New York Stock Exchange, there is the NASDAQ market, and then there's the OTC markets for every other publicly traded equity in the U.S. And that has created a lot of challenges because I was originally a NASDAQ and OTC trader who also ran an investment partnership from a value perspective. And the way that the OTC market worked back then was completely awful. There was a pink phone book which had a list of brokers who would trade a stock, and you'd look up the stock name, and then you'd call all the brokers and see who had the best price. You only had to call 3 brokers, so if you were the 4th call, you might not even get a call. And so it was a closed private club. Information was not available out to the world. So, in the biography of Warren Buffett, one of his successes was he was really good at negotiating with all these brokers to get the good prices. And there were these securities that traded, which were either speculative or discounted, lost securities. And so I was very frustrated with how the trading worked. And I'm like, I want to fix this. And that was getting all of the electronic, they weren't electronic back then. Electronic was picking up the phone. Market makers start putting in their prices real time, and then putting in the infrastructure for the trades to go back and forth in electronic messages. We were incredibly lucky because the SEC staff at the time thought it was an insane idea and didn't think I would succeed. And so they did a very reg light experiment. We did succeed. And when you add data and you make it available to a wider spectrum of the world, is the market becomes much more efficient. We improve market quality very rapidly. And then our next push was no blank screens. How do we get better information onto the screens about the different types of securities? And for that part of it, we really needed involvement of the issuers as well, because markets run on supply-demand pricing, but they also fundamental data. And rather than taking an approach of what I would call the prestige model of the traditional exchanges, because we have this wide range of securities. We have, it's running at over $500 billion volume now. It's been a busy markets. Is we have large international ADRs, Roche, Adidas, Heineken, brands we all know. We also have hundreds of community banks across the United States. And if a company goes bankrupt, it ends up trading in our markets. So we have this range of from speculative to global. So, and there's lots of different disclosure systems they all use. So our job was to digitalize it and really look at it from a functionality perspective. How do we get the fundamental information onto screens? How do we show not only the financial information, but the various different other types of data points and risk? And can we flag them? We will flag if we see promotion in the market, which is in our space about 1 or 2% of securities over a year, but they're pretty visible. The other thing we do is we force the companies to put out a press release describing if they believe the promotion is accurate, if they're paying for it, if insiders are selling into the market. And what's fantastic about that is the other 99 and 98% of issuers don't have more obligations on them. We use the market feedback loop. So I look at it as our path is always, we are a market services vendor, and we're always trying to improve market quality. And market quality is a much more obtainable goal than things like merit review. Because market quality, you're always trying to say, is there the connectivity and information and choice for there to be competitive trading? Is there also the information flows coming into the market for the market to do its job and be finding the next right price? And that part of it is something we've worked at, which is a very different. I try to describe it as the big blue exchanges have these luxury brands like Prada, where you walk out of the store, you paid a lot, you're fabulous. We're like Patagonia. We focus on functionality. We focus on what features you need and removing any fluff or frills you don't need so that you have the gear to achieve your mission. And whether it's supporting the broker-dealers trading the securities, and the broker-dealers trading our securities are Citadel, Virtu, Schwab, everybody, we're connected everywhere. Or you're the issuer who is trying to provide an efficient public market for your shareholders. So thanks for having me here.
Thanks. Alex?
Hello, I'm Alex Platt. I teach at the University of Kansas School of Law, and I am proposing that we fundamentally rethink the SEC's role in reviewing IPO filings. So just to back up for a second, you're a company, you want to sell your securities to public investors, you gotta file a registration statement. What's that? It's a very lengthy disclosure document, lots of information about your company, about the offering, all prescribed by the securities laws. Takes a lot of work, right? Right, Joel? It takes a lot of work to put these together. So it's work by some very sophisticated outside advisors, lawyers, accountants, investment banks, as well as some experts inside the firm. A couple months to put that together. And those folks who put it together are not only expert and sophisticated, they're also pretty well incentivized to get it right. And that's because they know that document they're putting together is going to be closely scrutinized by the big institutional investors who are thinking about whether to make an investment in this offering. And if things don't go well, they know the class action bar is waiting to scrutinize this document as well, looking for grounds for a securities fraud lawsuit. So what I've just described sounds like a pretty good system, pretty robust system, should give us some good sense of security about IPOs, but I've left something out. I've left something very important out that usually gets left out of discussions of the IPO process, and it's this. Before investors get to buy in, a team of government lawyers, government accountants at the SEC will do a line-by-line review of that document, asking questions, suggesting amendments, back and forth. They'll send a comment letter to the issuer with 30 or 40 detailed questions that the issuer then has to choose to respond to, push back on, back and forth until finally the SEC is satisfied. For the average IPO, this process adds 4 to 5 months to the IPO timeline. That's an eternity in the IPO ecosystem where you have these short windows of activity followed by long lulls. And as this comment letter process has grown ever more lengthy in recent years, what we see is issuers are pulling out of the process. They're filing and then withdrawing from the IPO process before going public rather than deal with the delay and uncertainty involved. I think it's time to rethink this process. I think it's outlived its utility. It made great sense back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s when it was implemented, but it doesn't make sense now. So let me say a couple things about that. In the 30s, you're an issuer, you want to go public. How are you going to know what to put in your disclosure? You don't know. It's a new system. It's very hard to figure out. So it makes sense that you want to talk to the SEC staff and go back and forth. Today, issuers have access to mountains of guidance, examples, precedents at the click of a button. They don't need the SEC to hold their hand in the same way. Back in the 30s, who were the investors in an IPO? Human beings, individuals. It made sense for the SEC to want to stand between the issuer and those individuals, protect those individuals. Who are the investors today? Big, sophisticated institutional investors. They can fend for themselves. And back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, if an issuer commits fraud, probably not going to face a Section 11 lawsuit. It was on the books, but almost never used. Today, not true. We have two things they didn't have: the class action and a very savvy and aggressive institutional class action plaintiff's bar, so that 10 to 20% of IPO firms can face some sort of securities fraud class action today. That means there's a real ex post deterrent threat. So the firms know if we commit fraud, we might be sued. So that gives them a reason to do it right in the first place. In short, I don't see any theoretical reason to expect that the SEC staff would be able to elicit material information that would not be elicited elsewhere in the IPO process. And the empirical evidence bears this out. There's a small body of studies in finance on the IPO comment process, and those studies show SEC comments do not reduce IPO underpricing and do not reduce the incidence of securities class actions. So I think policymakers at the SEC, in Congress, and the Senate should give a close look at significantly curtailing or overhauling this IPO comment process.
Thanks. Joel?
I'll say something really quickly, which is in this ongoing debate about how to make capital formation more efficient, there are proposals for reducing regulation, and they're met with opposition by those who don't want to reduce regulation or want to increase regulation. So on the one hand, you have groups, interests who are focused on fraud. And fraud, preventing fraud, Alex was just outlining, requires investor protection measures. And so if that's your concern, you're going to recoil in horror at any idea that sounds like reducing regulation, because regulation prevents fraud. This is one point of view. Then on the other side, you have a point of view that the regulation as it is right now is too costly. So you think of Sarbanes-Oxley, it was in response to the Enron, WorldCom scandals, corporate meltdowns. It greatly increased the cost of being a public company, and it did so in ways that were vastly out of proportion to what was predicted. As an example, in the adopting release for the implementation of just one section of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, Section 404, paragraph B, the SEC has to provide, under the Administrative Procedure Act, they have to give a cost-benefit analysis to support the idea that the regulation that they're adopting makes sense from a cost-benefit perspective. The SEC in that adopting release estimated that the cost of compliance with that one provision of Sarbanes-Oxley, Section 404B, would be about $93,000 per public company. The actual implementation cost of Section 404B of Sarbanes-Oxley was over $4 million per public company. There was no lawsuit overturning Section 404 because the cost-benefit analysis was flawed. That never happened. Even though that's when you see things under the litigation of the APA where a rule is overturned, it's usually it often has to do with that. That never happened. The rule is still on the books and it still applies. Now, the anti-fraud folks who focus singularly on let's prevent fraud would tell you 404 has done a lot of good in the world. It has required companies, especially large companies, to have effective internal controls. And that has done a lot to enhance the reliability of financial reporting and to prevent fraud. But the people who are focused on the cost of regulation say this is just out of control and we need to reduce the cost of regulation because if you think of regulation as pesticide, we've sprayed too much pesticide around the ecosystem, and we've killed off more than just the undesirable parts of the ecosystem that you spray pesticide to kill. We've killed the ecosystem, or significant parts of it. We've polluted our own capital markets ecosystem, say these people on the other side saying too much regulation, too costly, not enough capital formation. And in my experience with the IPO task force during the Obama administration, 2011, we made a number of proposals to make it easier to go public and stay public. And it succeeded. It became Title I of the Jobs Act of 2012. It was passed, the Jobs Act was passed by an overwhelming, bipartisan, nearly unanimous Congress. And I've since then testified a number of times before Congress because there's a lot of appetite. I mean, here in this forum and on Capitol Hill, there's a huge desire to replicate the success of the Jobs Act. And my number one takeaway for all of you to consider, and from that experience, is in the debate over more versus less regulation, you don't resolve that debate by figuring out the answer is more or the answer is less. You resolve that debate by balancing the regulation and calibrating it according to the size of the party being regulated. And that was the idea. That was one essential element of the IPO on-ramp, which is newly public companies entering the system for the first time get a break. They don't have to comply with all of the requirements of this internal controls audit of Sarbanes-Oxley, which I described. And they get a transition period of up to 5 years where they can ease into the system. So in thinking about going forward, what do we do? How do we promote capital formation? What kinds of changes can we make? That's an important lesson learned from 2012, is forget about more versus less, because that's not the answer. It ends in stalemate, and I don't think anybody really has the answer of what the single optimum level of regulation is going to be, because there's not one single optimum level. And it's frankly absurd to think that a mega cap company, a Fortune 10 company, with revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, many, many billions of dollars, requires the same level of regulation that a newly public company, say, pre-revenue biotech company that's trying to develop a drug. And we need a system that capitalizes on the idea of scaled regulation and brings more scaled regulation into the system, where the regulatory burden is lower on the low end and on the well-established huge companies. They get the full panoply of regulation. And not only does that make a lot of common sense, but it also cuts through this intractable tug of war that's never going to be resolved, because you have people who really hate fraud and they don't care about regulatory cost, and they would be happy to regulate everybody into oblivion because then we will have less fraud. And on the other side, you have people who don't really care about fraud, let the chips fall where they may, and it's not at all clear that some folks, some government employees in the beginning of the IPO process, Alex makes that very interesting, provocative point, that they really have much to do with preventing fraud. I think a lot of the, and I would concede, I think the liability provisions of the federal securities laws and the very active plaintiffs bar that we have together have a lot more to do with preventing fraud than whether you've complied with Regulation SK Item 703 in Part 2 of the registration statement, which has never prevented, the yes or no to that has not ever prevented one iota of fraud in the history of capital markets. With that, I'll pause, and I know we have a lot of ground to cover.
I will say I agree on Regulation SK, and I think I just certainly here fall on the side of a lot of regulation is pesticide, and a lot of that is not going towards fraud. So it's an interesting dichotomy that you put forward, and I want to talk some more about it. But before we get there, I want to take a step back to basically the basics here. We're talking today about capital formation, and we've talked about the small companies. Now we're talking about companies that are larger and headed towards the public markets. But this is kind of the basic securities question here is, why the public markets? What's good about the public markets? Why would a company want to be public? And why would investors want companies to be public? Can anyone help our audience with that question? Yeah, go for it.
So what I say, we're a public company, and we did not go public to raise capital. We went, we run a market, so we should eat our own cooking. But when we were private, we had a bunch of great value investors, institutional investors. They'd come visit and say, hey, Cromwell, your management team has done superb work. When are you selling? And when we went public, we distributed the shares out to the shareholders, and they put them in their brokerage firms. Our employees had shares, and it's valued every day. And there's a feedback loop. And we published our financials. It was interesting. The SEC read them and said, hey, you should probably register as an ATS. But the positive part is, what I say is, there's not a single professional sports team that doesn't play in a well-lit stadium with fans cheering and jeering. Quarters you have to be winning through or showing that you're losing. Referees, lines, all of these things. Being public is like that. It's the big leagues of companies in capitalism. And the part of capitalism, democracy dies in darkness, and the ability of an individual to be able to buy your shares is super important. But we don't really know what public is anymore, because it used to be, I'm public, I did an IPO, I rang the bell, I got this big wad of cash, and then I started selling cute computers. And everything was fantastic and sending out dividend checks to my happy investors. So, not every company needs to do an IPO now. Some companies that are public have actually never done a registered securities offering. So there's companies that is public, I could also say, is you've just registered with the SEC and your shares are now tradable under registration. There's also exemptions. You've had outside investors who've held their shares that have come to rest, and it's a tradable piece of property. And public markets are where I, as an outside shareholder, can exercise my supreme property right, which is to dispose of it, and in as efficient a manner as possible. And we forget that part. And public markets are an incredible thing. When you watch the news in the Middle East, what do? We go look at the public markets. We get a sense for our economy and of how we're doing. And so I'm a believer that we want to support companies that are public. And instead of this idea, you just have ESG reporting if you're public, private companies get a pass. It's harder to raise capital publicly than privately. Why? We have to start giving the preferences and privileges to companies that are transparent and allow citizens to own shares.
Anyone else?
I think Alex can explain, maybe not everybody in the audience is familiar with what the real distinction, what does it mean to be a private company versus a public company?
Yes.
Besides having one has a quoted stock price and the other doesn't, but
Right.
how do you get to that?
So there's something called the securities laws. The laws passed in the 30s, as updated over the last 100 years, create some rules for companies who want to sell their securities to the public. That's a loaded term. We're not going to cover that in today's class. But if you want to have a lot of people owning your shares, you're going to have to follow the SEC's rules, Congress's rules, and that involves making disclosures, both one big disclosure up front, which is that registration statement I was talking about, although in some cases there's a different path, as well as annual quarterly disclosures. So that's the heart of it. There's other things that come with it too, but that's the heart of it. So you choose to stay private if you want to avoid that, but then you can't have your shares trading so widely. So that's the basic trade-off.
Can I add on to that?
Please, please add.
I'll take it. So in the prior panel, we learned that under the Securities Act, which is the 33 Act, the very first federal securities law passed, every offer or sale of securities has to be registered with the SEC or exempt, and if not, it's illegal. So it's one of the two. Registering with the SEC is doing an IPO. It's not registering your car. It's not a one-line form and you're done in a day. It's a months-long process. It costs millions of dollars on average, and it's very costly. And then once you do that, you become obligated to report under the 34 Act, the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, requires public companies or reporting companies to file periodic reports with the SEC. So those are your annual reports, quarterly reports, as well as other filing obligations that arise from time to time. So if you do an IPO or if you have any form of registration statement that goes effective that triggers that Exchange Act periodic reporting obligation, so those are your public filings. And if you're not listed on an exchange, you might trade OTC. Or if you're listed on an exchange, that actually separately requires you to report under the Exchange Act. So it's this combination of registering your securities and going public, and then having this obligation, this ongoing obligation, to file periodic reports with the SEC, ongoing disclosures, your quarter, what happened this past quarter, and what happened at the end of each year. And so companies that have to do that are what we're referring to as public companies.
And I'll just say, I'll throw in, I'm a professor. I can talk all day if you get me going. This panel's about methods, ideas for drawing more companies into the public markets. The background there is that the number of companies coming public, staying public, has been going down for quite a while. The value of those companies has been going up. So there's consolidation among public companies, but the number of them has gone down. And so that's kind of the background. That's the background for the Jobs Act. The concern, kind of a bipartisan concern for some of the reasons we were hearing about before. This is a public program. It's funny to be at Cato, right? I mean, this whole panel is kind of about protecting and promoting a government program called securities regulation. The public market is a government program, and kind of the theme here is it's a good government program, but there's stuff that's kind of accumulated over time, well-intentioned, that has kind of undercut that program so that fewer companies are willing to make that trade-off and go public or stay public. So that's kind of my understanding of what we're here to talk about.
Well, let
It
me
is, I
just
say,
throw in.
Alex is trying to get me fired by saying.
Oh, I'm sorry.
promoting
No.
government
Well, I don't know.
But-
Public, like, you know, there were people who were saying we should just get rid of securities, right? That's like the pure libertarian view. Let's just get rid of mandatory disclosure. That's not what we're saying. We're saying public companies are really great. That's the panel. And let's make sure that companies still have a reason to go and become public instead of staying private forever. That's the premise.
And reform, so I saw Steve Forbes' picture out there, and I thought a lot of these people were throwing around tax ideas, like tax credit for this, for that. So I am not a lobbyist, have never lobbied for anything, except for the Jobs Act, which happened to be something in my corner of the world, and I had the experience as one of the leaders of the IPO task force of literally walking the halls of Congress and pitching this with the co-chair of the IPO task force, Kate Mitchell, amazing woman, and she and I had she is a venture capitalist, and she and I, it was almost like we had a fundraising pitch. We'd sit down next to each other, and she would go with her part, and I would go with my part. And it was like, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Player, where they're pitching movies to producers. I felt kind of like that. It was an amazing experience, but we came at this from the perspective of IPO activity has fallen off dramatically, and that's not a good thing. Why is it not a good thing? Because when an early stage company comes to the point where it's grown enough and it's ready to return capital to its early stage investors, some of whom we heard from in the prior panel, it has two choices. It can sell the company or it can go public. The third option is to go bankrupt, which is not attractive. And that's why you want like 50 investments in your portfolio if you're gonna hit on these. If you're gonna follow a venture capital model, you need to invest a lot because a lot of these companies are not going to pan out. But the ones that do can either sell the company to an acquirer or they can go public. And if suddenly we have, say around 2002, Sarbanes-Oxley, we've now regulated the daylights out of being a public company, which is great. No more Enrons, no more WorldComs. But again, they were mega cap companies earning hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, or at least reporting hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. And they shouldn't be regulated the way that a new public company should be regulated. And somehow Congress decided in 2002, let's regulate all public companies exactly the same. And wow, what a surprise. Since then, we've had fewer public companies. We have fewer public companies. Why is that bad? If you don't immediately grasp the connection between the IPO process, between going public and job creation, then let me ask you this. Imagine Seattle is maybe not, and when we were pitching this idea in 2011, it was before Summer of Love and a lot of changes in Seattle. So imagine, Seattle's a beautiful place. Imagine how Seattle would look like if Microsoft had been bought by IBM instead of going public, or if Amazon had been bought by Barnes & Noble instead of going public. Now, and we had the data to back it up. It wasn't just a catchy word picture, but that was the word picture. The data to back it up is that 90% of job creation for a company happens after its IPO. So that's why, ladies and gentlemen, members of Congress, that's why you want IPOs. They're good for America. They power job creation, because in mergers, you have efficiencies, like, right? What are efficiencies? Efficiencies are just cutting a whole bunch of jobs that overlap. So you want to promote IPO activity. You don't want the scale tilted toward M&A as the only way to exit and away from IPO.
And, so I did the op-ed this weekend, and the insider secret of the investment banker who pitches companies on going public is most smaller companies, once they go public in an IPO or a direct listing or whatever, are forced by regulations to continue to raise capital privately. And these capital raises are done through unregulated intermediaries, and they are toxic to both public markets and capital structures and investors. They're terrible. And it's the reason we've seen hundreds of reverse splits on the exchanges in our markets. They prefer the exchanges because the people providing this financing run into fewer AML blockers. And, and this is not a new thing. 2017, there was a story of a Greek shipping company that had done 17 reverse splits, and basically the shareholders disappear, and nothing happened. And this is a challenge we say about the regulators is, one of the hard parts for regulators is they all just own the S&P 500 index fund. They don't know fundamental investing. So we're trying to have them do the signals into the market to create an initial market, and they just they skim the cream off the top, and anytime something doesn't work, it doesn't go. So what we need to do, and Reg A is a starting point, but we need to do it for S3, F3s, is ATMs, if you're a WIXI, which we'll just call a big company, is you can sell shares directly into the market through a broker in regular brokerage transactions passively. So if the company thinks that the market is well priced, they can quickly sell shares into the market at a very low cost. The money goes right to the company's treasury. If you are an OTC company, a newly public company, a company with a smaller float, you're locked out. If you're an in-between company, you've got the SEC staff reviewing your documents, so you can't respond quickly to real time. So this shelf offering, the ATM, was invented. It was hugely controversial. There was a speech by an SEC commissioner who said, this should only be for debt offerings, even though we're just doing it for these large companies because those markets are harder to manipulate, which means less volatile. Well, don't we want the smartest player, one of the smartest players, giving that signal transparently? And I'll give what I think is a superb example is during the meme stock craze, CBS Viacom stock was shooting up, and they had capital needs. They were investing. And it was shooting up because there was some swaps going on with a firm called Archegos. So they had their thumb there. They announced, because they're a WIXI, they announced a shelf offering and publicly announced, so everybody knows it's coming, more shares. There's an imbalance in supply and demand in the market. Market's not working right. Stock's down 10 points with which they get it off. That broke the fever of the meme stock craze. And it's an incredible market efficiency thing. Private offerings, you can have a price that the investor sees on the screen is here. NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, and OTC, the disease is throughout every public company. And there's a private offering taking place here. There's a total disconnect, broken market pricing process. So we want to bring back public markets is for those companies that need capital, is bringing in ATM offerings. Now for Reg A is fantastic because the staff has the ability to do ATMs. When they first did the rulemaking, we said you should have ATMs. They said we're not ready, it's this new thing. I think it's a more popular idea today, and it also has blue sky preemption. The SEC would need to, for S3s and F3s, they would need to also go back and get blue sky preemption for securities that are OTC, because these are brokers' transactions. is one of the protections that they put in of ATM offerings is the brokers aren't out there soliciting demand. They're not ginning up. They're not on the phone. They're selling into the market directly through exchanges, through ATSs, to institutions. And, and every broker-dealer is SEC regulated and registered. So again, why should there be state regulation jumping in and slowing these things down? We do that change, we will fix capital formation for the tenderloin of the markets, which supports the S&P 500. And I don't want to be all negative. We're winning globally. We are winning. The S&P 500 stocks have the lowest cost of capital in the world. Everybody wants to invest their retirement savings in there. We're winning. But we can take that, we can share that wealth of winning across all public companies. And the fantastic part about Reg A is there's a limit to how much you can raise. So the risk into the market, it was one of the smartest things that ever came out, crowdfunding. We can debate the levels, but the individual risk to each one of the system is capped, which is fantastic.
That was one thing we said during the IPO task force days when we were advocating for a lighter touch on IPOs. We said all of IPOs are less than 3% of total market capitalization. Less than 3%. So you can afford to give them a break. Let these companies come into the system.
This is not, we also get lost. What's a public company? Is the index funds are the greatest investment, the greatest the greatest thing on earth for savings. It was an invention where they took all these speculative securities, and if they become more valuable, you get more in your portfolio, and if they become less valuable, you get less. So that you take the cream of the public markets and you turn a speculative investing product into a safe savings product. It was an incredible invention. But we lost the plot of what stock markets are, which is risk. 60% of public companies burn investors' capital. And that is fine. That's how the system operates.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience, if there's any in the room. I'm looking. Any questions in the room? If not, then I'm,
You got one back.
say we got one in the back. I was going to say, otherwise I'll just wind you guys up again.
Thank you,
and
David.
let you go. Because I have plenty more questions.
David Burton, the Heritage Foundation. Cromwell, you talked a little bit about blue sky, but it strikes me that the fact that OTC markets securities are generally not treated as covered securities and exempt from blue sky, whereas the exchanges are, and that Tier 1 Reg A securities are not covered securities, and Tier 2 is only on the initial issuance, but not in the secondary market, dramatically raises costs for small companies seeking to raise capital in the public market. So my question to all three of you, I really have two related questions, is first, should we preempt blue sky laws, state securities regulation, with respect to OTC market securities and the Reg A Tier 1 and Tier 2 secondary offerings? And the second related question is, in your judgment, do the state security regulators really contribute very much to the investor protection party, or are they just a cost sink?
So the first part is, I think we have a robust federal regulatory regime for companies that are SEC reporting and compliant. So I think for those, there's definitely a case that the state should be removed. I also think broker-dealer trading is fully electronic. It wasn't. And if you look at when they gave the exchanges a full preemption, Congress was very explicit there, and Congress also had this idea of an investor who is sophisticated enough. But when you read the notes from committee, they actually also say what type of security is national in trading, because that should have a national regulator. You don't want New York here, Mississippi here. And that part of it is, so I think all electronic trading by broker-dealers should be, is if there's just a real clean out on that one. Sales practices, when you're doing solicited outbound business, that's probably better well debated. I mean, and with the state regulators themselves. So when Apple went public, it was blue sky. NASDAQ had 27 states, and Massachusetts brags about how we didn't let them sell to our retail investors, but Fidelity could buy shares, which seems a little bad. Same thing about Intel, same thing about Genentech. And it's kind of the same situation. We have 41 states that represent our OTCQX market, which has governance, profitability, no penny stocks. So the majority of state regulators are actually pretty thoughtful. And Mark Ueda had a good idea that said, look, if you're blue sky in your state of incorporation and you're blue sky in your state, your state where your main headquarters is, maybe you should be blue sky across the country. Let Massachusetts, I think they've lost the incorporation game, but they've got a few headquarters that they may make it, and let's bring back states competing, which is really interesting because we're seeing Texas compete for litigation protections. And that's a place where it was fantastic in our nation's history when states would innovate on things and then we would nationalize the good ideas.
A mentor of mine was working at a state securities commission during the Apple IPO, so obviously before my time, and he's now retired, but his boss was preventing the registration of Apple in that state. And he said, well, why were you doing that? It's because Steve Jobs is getting paid too much. It's like, they're trading at 3 times the IPO price. How were we protecting investors? So that's the flaw of merit regulation right there.
His protege is still there. His name is Peter.
So I'm curious, I see any other hands up in the audience. Curious, we've been talking about different pathways to public company status. You mentioned direct listings. We've heard a lot about SPACs over the course of the past couple of years. They went away. Maybe they're coming back. Who knows?
Probably not quite the way they were, yeah.
Not the way they were.
SPAC-orama is not going to come back.
Yeah.
And kind of the pressure on the regular IPO process from some of these competitors has started to break up a little bit of the traditional way IPOs have been done. The lockup periods have been shrinking. There's been other things that companies might feel are beneficial that the underwriters are willing to negotiate on. Do you see these changes or these multiple pathways to public company status as presenting benefits to increasing the number of public companies, or is this all just kind of water under the bridge because it's not significant enough?
I mean,
or is it harmful?
So Canada has this thing called a CPC, which is the government-sponsored shell. Most companies that go public in Canada use a reverse merger. So, there's the commercial way and the regulatory blessed way. You want both going along. And it's very hard Bill Ackman has the best analysts in the world, and he can't tell you what's going to be a good investment all the time. He's blown up spectacularly on things. I mean, all his friends on Twitter remind him of it every day. So our expectation is we shouldn't be choosing one path is better or another, but we should be trying to open them up and educate people to use whatever tool it is that is most useful, and there be transparency to the risks of investors. I mean, SPACs brought great buzz. Every new idea has a frenzy and, a hangover, and people wake up and show up at the party a little smarter the next time and stay away from the punch bowl. That part of it is really, we always have this debate because people will come to us and say, you need to put a rule in because this is happening. And my view is, how do you put the information into the market so a smart investor this is really important, someone who reads and someone who looks at disclosure can react to it and make a good choice. The land of good choice is because of disclosure. And that's, really is a disclosure-based market. I always think, because my great-great-great-grandfather ran for vice president on the Prohibition Party, and they got second place, best showing ever. But the Securities Act came after the Prohibition was repealed. And we had a choice of merit review and disclosure-based review. And I think the country at that time was very much, let's have disclosure. And that's the system we've built, and that's part of the reason America is the greatest capital market in the world, and it's disclosure with consequences, as you guys so much more eloquently said than I could, but that's the part we should lean into. But what is the disclosure that inoculates the market, and the market can become a learning machine? But also getting past is, we're going to have all these frenzies and bubbles, and we're going to come back smarter, and we're going to come back stronger and better.
So the big one, I think, is M&A. Like, we have a few SPACs now. There were a lot for a year, but mostly not. There's 1 or 2 direct listings. The big thing is mergers. Research shows if you treat every merger into a public company as if it were an IPO, the IPO decline disappears. It's another way of going public, right? If you're a private company, you're a startup, you get acquired by a large public company. Now you're part of a public. So that's where all the IPOs have gone in the last couple of decades. They've gone into Google, or a large company that has bought that company. And so I think a takeaway for Congress people, for policymakers, is if you're going to ratchet up the regulatory pressure on IPOs, you're pushing more companies to do mergers. So if that's the policy that you want, great. If it's not, and I think we heard that there's some reasons to worry about that, consolidation, other concerns, you might worry about that. So even if you're preventing fraud in the public companies, that comes at a cost. And the cost is consolidation. Everyone's getting merged into the same 3 giant companies.
And then that brings up, there's 2 sides of cost of capital, which is S&P 500 companies have very high valuations because of all the investment funds. And then private equity has an advantage because interest is deductible versus dividends. The tax policy is, and another place, and this is important because half the public companies don't need capital. They create capital. And we have to think about, why would you go public if you don't need capital? And one of the things I think we really want to look at is tax policy to make dividends in public companies deductible in the same manner as interest that gets put out, because this is really important. We pay a dividend rather than buying back our stock. Even though it's slightly less capital efficient, we do it because that's the best way to attract small investors. They trust you if you pay out part of your earnings. They know those earnings are real. And so a pass-through dividend policy has worked so well for the REIT business. I think for smaller public companies, they're not in the S&P 500, they should be allowed to treat their dividend payments to common shareholders, deduct them like interest.
And I'm going to give Joel the last word here, because I think you've both given us your last words in terms of where
I've got so much more.
you've got so many more words. If we only had time. 2012 Jobs Act passed, has been in effect for over a decade now. Congress is looking at additional tweaks to that process. In fact, the House yesterday passed a bill that would extend emerging growth company status for a little bit further time. What did Congress miss in 2012, and what should they be looking at doing in 2025?
So we talk about tax break for this, or different ways of tweaking the tax code to promote different kinds of activities. Those kinds of things. Or we talked, Alex, you mentioned just repealing all of both of the principal federal securities laws.
Not proposing that.
propose
Setting
it,
it up as an extreme. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's certain things that just aren't going to happen. And so when you focus energies on the policymakers, the legislators who are able to make change, you can't just get a sale with one office. You need a sale with a broad coalition on the Hill. And so it needs to be attractive in a bipartisan way. And I think a lot of the ingredients of the Jobs Act success are instructive today. So you don't necessarily want to do something sweeping and overarching. You want to look for small changes that can have an outsized impact. So the confidential SEC review process is an example. We didn't get into the details, but the point is, just by allowing people to go to submit their registration statement confidentially, and so you're a private company, nobody has all of this information, you can begin the IPO process confidentially with the SEC, start that SEC review process Alex was talking about, without having to throw it all out there to the public, where the first people who read it are not going to be your prospective investors, they will be all of your competitors, who will then call up their customers and read your risk factors to them. Look how risky this company is. And so you can start the process, and by the way, most companies, like you also said, Alex, most companies that start the process don't come out on the other side as a public company. So just that small change to allow a company to begin the process confidentially while they're going through SEC review, while they're figuring out whether they have a shot to pull off an actual IPO, made a huge difference. You didn't have to repeal the 33 and 34. You didn't have to you didn't have to pass a tax break for anything. Just make one little tweak, and you make a big difference for the IPO process. So we did a lot of little things like that that accumulated to a meaningful change, and that's what I would continue to look for, what I continue to advocate for when people on the Hill call me with asking for ideas. Like, let's put down everything on paper. I have it's in my testimony, my written testimony, 40 pages of little things that we could do. So they're out there for the collecting and the implementing.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. As before, there's so many more things that we could talk about if only we had the time. Appreciate your perspectives today. Thank you. Thanks to our audience for joining us. If you found this discussion interesting, I say please continue the conversation. It's a highly complex topic and a lot of things to talk about. We will have recordings of today's event available online, and I would encourage you to follow the work of the scholars at Cato Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives as we think about ideas about how to improve the capital formation landscape in the United States. So thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.